What if wearing a crown meant inheriting a curse? For centuries, royal families twisted bloodlines to keep power pure and broke generations of women in the process. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the hidden history of deformity madness and betrayal by blood. Today, we unveil the top 10 most inbred women in history and expose the royals' darkest, most disturbing secret. Their stories are not just tragic, they are haunting, and number 1 will leave you speechless. So watch until the very end, because the deeper we go, the more unsettling it becomes. But before we descend into the shadows, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. At number 10, we begin with Isabella II of Spain, a queen by title, but a victim by birth. Born in 1830, her arrival was seen as a bittersweet compromise, a daughter when the kingdom had longed for a son. But Isabella came with more than royal blood. She came bearing the scars of generations before her. Her parents were uncle and niece, and her grandparents on one side were also her great-grandparents on the other. Her lineage was a maze, a genetic echo chamber, where the same names circled endlessly. At just 16, Isabella was forced to marry her double second cousin. She bore 11 children, but only 5 survived. And even that legacy is murky, because many historians believe her husband fathered none of them. Their union was cold-strained and shadowed by unspoken truths. In the end, Isabella lost her crown. But the real tragedy, she was never free. Not from duty, not from blood, not from the price her family paid for political power. At number 9, we meet Louise of Austria, a woman born to one of the most entangled dynasties in Europe. Her parents weren't just cousins, they were double first cousins, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. Imagine that your mother and father have the exact same family tree. Twice. Of 12 children, only 7 lived past infancy. And genetically, Louise had just 4 unique great-grandparents. That's half of what a human being should have. She was a compressed soul, a child born of mirrors, not branches. At 18, she was married off to Napoleon Bonaparte, her father's enemy. A political pawn in a chess game she never asked to play. To the world, she was Empress of the French, but inside, she was a girl wrapped in silk and silence, burdened by the weight of a crumbling empire and a bloodline too tight to breathe. Number 8 brings us to I of Portugal, remembered by some as Maria the Pious. But history tells a darker tale, Maria the Broken. Born in 1734, she was the child of yet another royal gamble. Her father and mother were the 16th closely related Iberian royal couple. But that wasn't enough. To preserve the family name, Maria later married her own uncle. Yes, her uncle. She gave birth to multiple children, but nearly half didn't survive. Those who did carried the weight of invisible defects passed down through looping blood. As she aged, Maria's mind began to unravel. She heard voices. She withdrew. She screamed in the night. Eventually, she was declared mentally unfit to rule and hidden from the public eye. Her downfall wasn't the result of war, betrayal, or revolution. It was written in her DNA. At number 7 is a name long buried in the shadowy folds of French royalty, Marie-Louise Elisabeth d'Orléans. She was born into a dynasty of scandal. Her father, the illegitimate son of Louis XIV, was forced to marry his own cousin. And from that union came Marie-Louise, a girl who was never allowed to choose her future. She was married off, of course, to another cousin, Charles, Duke of Berry. They had 3 children. None lived beyond childhood. By 14, Marie-Louise had already found solace at the bottom of a wine bottle. Alcohol wasn't just her escape. It was her rebellion, the only rebellion she had. History doesn't speak her name often, but if you listen closely, you can hear the clinking of glass echoing through the dark halls of Versailles, and the quiet sobs of a young woman crushed beneath the weight of her own bloodline. Number 6 may surprise you because she's not centuries old. She's modern. She's alive. Princess Alexia of Greece was born in 1965, the daughter of Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark and King Constantine of Greece. Their love story made headlines, but behind the fairy tale was a family tree tied in knots. Anne-Marie and Constantine weren't just royals. They were second cousins and third cousins. Their shared ancestors looped back again and again, brothers marrying sisters generation after generation. Alexia and her siblings were the products of one of the last great royal unions between sitting monarchs from two houses. They were raised in palaces, but carried the quiet burden of centuries-old traditions where purity meant marrying your own blood and calling it destiny. Coming in at number 5 is perhaps the most genetically extreme woman on this list, and yet, almost no one remembers her name. Maria Antonia of Austria. She was a member of the infamous Habsburg dynasty, a family whose obsession with blood purity was so severe, their family tree resembled a spiral more than a branch. Maria Antonia was the product of repeated inbreeding, so intense, modern scientists estimate her genetic makeup was equivalent to the child of 2 full siblings. Think about that. And yet her story is often eclipsed by her more famous uncle Charles II of Spain, the Habsburg, whose face became the poster child for inbreeding deformities. But if Charles was the face, Maria Antonia was the blueprint. She died young, sickly, and forgotten, but her DNA still whispers a warning carved into history's most fragile women. Number 4 takes us far from the marble courts of Europe into the scorched sands of ancient Egypt. Here lie 2 tiny bodies, perfectly preserved. Infants, wrapped in linen, frozen in time. Known only as Mummies 317A and 317B, they were the daughters, possibly stillborn, of Pharaoh Tutankhamun and his queen, Ankhesenamun. But there's a darker truth. Ankhesenamun wasn't just his wife. She was his half-sister. Tutankhamun himself was born of incest. His parents were also full siblings. By the time his daughters were conceived, the family's gene pool had collapsed in on itself. The result: babies born with spinal deformities, cleft palates, and bone malformations. Their short lives, if they lived at all, were silent echoes of a dynasty unraveling from the inside out. Divine blood, they called it. But even the gods couldn't protect them from their own genetics. Number 3 takes us not to a palace, but to the remote outskirts of modern-day Australia. A place where the echoes of royal bloodlines are replaced by something even darker: secrecy, silence, and unchecked decay. Her name is Kimberly, a pseudonym given to protect what little remains of her shattered identity. Born into what authorities would later call the Colt family cult, Kimberly is the product of multiple generations of incest, not royalty, but isolation. No kings, no crowns, just forgotten farmland, and a closed-loop family system that spiraled out of control. Fathers became brothers. Mothers became cousins. Children became genetically bound in ways even science struggled to categorize. When authorities intervened, they uncovered a biological horror: children who could not speak, who bore severe deformities, who could not identify who their father was, because there were too many possible answers. Kimberly's body became a case study, her life an indictment of what happens when bloodlines turn inward, and no one is watching. She was never a princess, but her story may be the most disturbing of them all. Number 2 is a name we often mistake for romance, power, and beauty. But behind the glamorized myths lies a legacy of chilling calculation. Cleopatra II Philopator, not to be confused with the more famous Cleopatra VII, was perhaps the most inbred woman to ever rule a throne. Her parents, siblings. Her grandparents, also siblings. Her siblings married each other, and she too was married within that same web, first to her brother, and later to her own nephew. This wasn't love. It was dynasty preservation at all costs. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, Greek by blood, Egyptian by rule, believed in divine lineage. But their obsession with keeping the blood pure turned the royal family into a genetic time bomb. Madness, sterility, violence. Cleopatra II ruled, yes, But she ruled over the ashes of her family's own design. She wasn't just a queen. She was the final product of a bloodline that twisted itself into oblivion. And finally, number 1. The woman who may have carried the heaviest burden of royal blood in human history, Joanna of Austria, daughter of an emperor's sister to a king and prisoner of a dynasty that folded in on itself. Born in 1535 to Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Isabella of Portugal, Joanna came from a family tree so tightly knotted it could barely stand. Her parents were first cousins, her grandparents uncle and niece, her great-grandparents, the same names repeated again and again. In fact, Joanna's inbreeding coefficient, a genetic measure of how closely related someone's parents are, has been calculated by modern historians to match that of a child born from full siblings. She was never meant to be free. She was born to continue the chain. At 16, she was married off to her double cousin John of Portugal, a man just as genetically compromised as she was. Their union produced one child, Sebastian, future King of Portugal, who would grow to be unstable, impulsive, and utterly unfit to rule. His reckless campaign in Morocco led to his death at 24, and with him, the collapse of the Portuguese royal line. Joanna, meanwhile, spent much of her life in cloistered silence. Illness, emotional withdrawal, religious fervor, all signs perhaps of a mind slowly sinking beneath the weight of generations of incestuous legacy. They called her pious. They called her devout, but behind every prayer was a shadow. The shadow of a woman who never had a chance to be anything more than what her blood allowed. She wasn't just a daughter of Habsburg. She was its genetic conclusion, the silent scream at the end of a bloodline that tried to conquer the world and destroyed itself instead. Behind every crown, there is a cover-up. What the public saw were portraits, regal faces, divine poses, silk gowns, and glowing children lined up like painted perfection. But behind closed doors, royal families were desperately hiding the consequences of their own ambition. Some children never made it to the canvas. They were stillborn, deformed, or mentally unfit, whisked away to private monasteries hidden from the court, and quietly erased from the lineage. Documents were altered, midwives silenced, physicians sworn to secrecy. In the Habsburg court, painters were instructed to soften deformities. In the Bourbon dynasty, certain births were never recorded. In Egypt, malformed royal infants were embalmed not to be honored, but to be forgotten. But the darkest truth, sometimes, the inbreeding was so severe the solution wasn't to stop, it was to cover. There are whispers of royals being told to produce heirs, not with their husband, but with a trusted outsider, to dilute the bloodline quietly. These children were raised as legitimate, but were never truly royal, just pawns in a greater illusion. And still, the cycle continued, because in the world of monarchy, the appearance of power was more important than its cost. You may think this was just the past, that these were stories sealed in ancient palaces, long-dead bloodlines, and dusty tombs. But echoes remain. In remote towns, in isolated families, in communities forgotten by modernity where blood still turns inward and history repeats itself in silence. The names may change, but the pattern persists, power protecting itself at the cost of the vulnerable. And the women, they are the first to bleed. Some were crowned, others were hidden, many were erased, all were broken. Because royalty was never about love, it was about control, about sealing the gates of power so tightly that even fresh air could not enter. In the end, these women, these daughters of dynasties, remind us of a cruel irony, that those born to rule were often the most imprisoned. They wore jewels forged from duty. They bore children for bloodlines, not love. They smiled for portraits, while their bodies unraveled from within. History remembers the kings, but it forgets the women who paid the price for their ambition. Until now, if their stories moved you, if they unsettled you, click like, share this with someone who still believes in fairy tales. And subscribe to History's Hidden Horrors where we reveal the truths most kingdoms tried to bury. Because the past doesn't sleep. It waits.